Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. 6 years ago, they took my home over the color of a fence. They thought I'd disappear. Instead, I vanished into the shadows, building power, buying silence, and waiting. Now I'm back, not for revenge, but for justice. And justice in Oakwood Hills is about to kick down the front door. I still remember the smell of fresh cedar the day I finished my fence. That warm, rich scent was the smell of privacy, of a man marking the edges of what was his. I had hired a crew to put up a tall, solid wooden fence around my backyard, the kind of barrier that lets you sit outside in your underwear drinking coffee without worrying about Mrs. Henderson 2 houses down commenting on your choice of socks. It was a deep brown, stained to bring out the grain, sturdy enough to keep the wind out and nosy neighbors from peeking in. At least that's what I thought. In my head, the whole project was just another homeowner upgrade. You want something. You buy it, you build it, you enjoy it. That's how it works for normal people. But in our little slice of suburban hell, we had the HOA, the Homeowners Association. On paper, they were there to protect property values and maintain community standards. In reality, they were a neighborhood mafia with bylaws instead of baseball bats. And running this little cartel was Karen Stanley, our president for life. Karen had the kind of personality that made you wonder how she hadn't been accidentally locked in a trunk during one of her endless surprise inspections. She had short blonde hair that looked like it had been cut with a ruler, a permanent squint of disapproval, and a voice that could sand varnish off wood. The morning after my fence went up, she was at my door holding a clipboard, lips pressed so tight they looked stapled together. "Mr. Morgan," she began as if reading a summons. "This fence is in violation of HOA Code Section 4, subsection B, regarding approved color palette for exterior structures." I stared at her for a second. "It's a fence, Karen. It's a brown fence," she corrected, like I'd just called her poodle a cat. "Our palette allows only natural unstained wood or shades of white and beige. This," she tapped the clipboard, "is an unapproved color." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "It's wood. Brown is the natural color of wood." She glared at me as if I'd confessed to burning down the clubhouse. "You have 30 days to correct this violation, or fines will be imposed." 30 days turned into 2 weeks before the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox, and the fines began, $500 a week. At first, I ignored them. Then the notices got nastier. "Final warning. Legal action pending." Each letter had more capital letters and exclamation points than the last, like they were written by a caffeinated dictator. By the 3rd month, the fines had ballooned into the tens of thousands. I called my lawyer, a calm guy named Rick, who had the permanent expression of a man reading the world's worst joke. He explained that our HOA had the right to place a lien on my property for unpaid fines, and if the lien wasn't resolved, they could foreclose. "They can take my house over a fence?" I asked. Rick shrugged. "They can take your house over a broken mailbox if they follow procedure." I thought it was bluff. It wasn't. 6 months after that first knock on my door, I was standing in a county courtroom, listening to a judge in wire-rimmed glasses explain that my failure to comply with HOA regulations and pay accrued fines left them no choice but to authorize the foreclosure. My house, my 2-story pride and joy, was ordered to be sold at auction to satisfy the debt. Karen was there in the back row, pretending to check her phone, a faint smile tugging at her mouth like she was holding back a laugh. 2 weeks later, I was hauling boxes into a rented moving truck, while strangers wandered through my yard, measuring things for their potential remodel. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. Most of my neighbors had been silent during the whole mess, some too scared to get on Karen's bad side, others probably glad to see me go. When I finally locked the door for the last time, I stood by the gate, my gate, and looked at that brown fence, the same fence that had started all of this. My hands clenched on the key until my knuckles hurt. I wasn't just losing my home. I was losing the neighborhood where I'd invested years of work, money, and memories. As I dropped the key into the realtor's envelope, I made myself a promise. I didn't whisper it. I said it out loud, letting it hang in the air like a curse. "I'll be back, Karen, and when I come back, I'm taking all of this from you." I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking in the mirror. Not because I didn't want to see it, but because I didn't want that last image of my home to be her standing on the curb, watching me leave, thinking she'd won. 6 years is a long time to hold a grudge, but for me, it wasn't just a grudge. It was a project, a slow-burn investment of patience, planning, and just the right amount of venom. After I left that neighborhood, I swore I wouldn't crawl back until I had the resources to make it worth my while. Back then, I had my pride and a decent savings account. 6 years later, I had something much better: capital, connections, and a very specific skill set. I rebuilt fast. At first, I threw myself into work because it kept me from thinking about the fence, the house, and the smug tilt of Karen's head when the judge read the foreclosure order. My company specialized in commercial property acquisition and redevelopment. Within 2 years, I had flipped 3 apartment buildings and a strip mall. I learned the quiet routes banks take to offload distressed assets, how to hide my fingerprints behind a dozen shell companies, and which lawyers loved dismantling stubborn boards of directors for sport. Contacts started to pile up. A banker in Dallas who could move large sums through legitimate investment groups without drawing attention. A retired city zoning inspector who knew how to turn a minor permit violation into a months-long nightmare. A real estate attorney who had once helped dissolve an entire HOA in Arizona after proving election fraud in its board. They weren't friends. Friends are a liability, but they were tools. And I kept my tools sharp. One Thursday evening, over drinks in Austin, an old colleague let something slip. "You remember that neighborhood you used to live in, Oakwood Hills?" I didn't look up from my glass. Vaguely. "They're drowning." HOA took on a big renovation project, new clubhouse roof, upgraded pool, landscaping contracts, and botched it. Over budget, under-delivered. They took out a loan, interest rates bleeding them dry. Word is they're looking to sell off a few properties they repossessed. Fast cash to keep the lights on. It was like someone had just handed me a loaded gun and walked away. I didn't act excited. That's how you make people suspicious. I just nodded and asked a few innocent questions. How many properties? What price range? Were they selling to outside buyers or just current residents? Within a week, I had the list. 8 houses. All foreclosed within the past 3 years. All in decent shape. All priced to move. I could have bought them in my own name, but that would have been like announcing a parade before the marching band showed up. Instead, I formed 3 LLCs in different states, each with its own managing member, real people loyal to me who owed me favors. On paper, they were just ambitious investors snapping up undervalued homes in a nice area. The first 3 purchases went through without a hitch. The HOA board, desperate for cash, didn't bother to dig deeper. By the time the 4th and 5th deals closed, I had to work harder to keep things quiet. Karen, as president, signed off on every transaction, but she didn't know my face was behind the ink. Not yet. I didn't just buy houses, I bought votes. In that HOA, each property meant 1 vote in board elections and community decisions. By the time I held control of 6 of the 8 newly acquired properties, along with 2 more I bought quietly through private sales from residents looking to move, I controlled nearly half the voting power in Oakwood Hills. And nobody, not even Karen, had put the pieces together. One evening, I drove out to the edge of the development. I didn't go in. Not yet. Just parked far enough away to see the glow of the street lamps and the silhouettes of those cookie-cutter homes. From where I sat, the place looked exactly the same as the day I'd left, right down to the manicured hedges and the identical mailboxes. I thought about the people living behind those walls. Some of them probably still paying ridiculous HOA fees, still getting fined for leaving a garbage can out too long, still jumping when they saw Karen's SUV crawling past their driveway. They had no idea the ground under their feet was shifting. It was almost time. The next board election was in 3 months. Karen would be there, presiding like a queen over her fiefdom. And I'd be there too, except I wouldn't be just another resident with a complaint. I'd be the man who could decide whether she kept her crown or lost her head. For the first time in 6 years, I felt something close to happiness. Not the easy kind you get from a good meal or a weekend trip. This was sharper, heavier, the kind of satisfaction that comes when you've been sharpening a blade for years and finally get to test the edge. The annual HOA board meeting was the kind of event most residents avoided unless they had nothing better to do on a Tuesday night. Usually, it was an hour of Karen reading reports in that nasal, condescending tone of hers, while a handful of neighbors complained about dog poop on sidewalks or teenagers playing basketball too late. This year, however, there was an open seat on the board. The treasurer had resigned unexpectedly, citing personal reasons that, if my sources were right, involved a quiet disagreement with Karen over creative accounting I'd been preparing for. This night for months, my LLC representatives, the official owners of the properties I controlled, had all submitted proxies designating me as their voting representative. My name appeared nowhere on the official ownership records, but legally, I had the right to cast votes for each property I represented. 8 votes in a community where a typical election drew maybe 20 total. That was a hammer big enough to smash any wall Karen tried to build. When I walked into the community center that evening, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. Karen was already at the head table, flanked by the remaining board members. She was wearing a pastel blazer, pearls, and the same smirk I remembered from the courthouse. Her eyes flicked over me and then back to her notes without a hint of recognition. That was fine. I wanted the reveal to hurt. The meeting started predictably. Karen ran through the state of the community speech, bragged about some landscaping project, and blamed unexpected cost overruns for the fact that HOA dues would rise again next quarter. When the agenda reached the election for the open seat, the room shifted. A couple of residents nominated friends. One guy nominated himself. I waited until the nominations were about to close. Then I stood up. "My name's Dylan Morgan," I said, loud enough to carry over the scrape of folding chairs. "I represent 8 properties in Oakwood Hills, and I'd like to nominate myself for the open board position." The murmur that followed was immediate. Karen's head snapped up like I'd just fired a gun. For a moment, she just stared, her mind clearly trying to match my name to a memory she didn't want to dig up. Then I saw it, that flicker of recognition followed by a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "this is unexpected, but of course anyone in good standing can run. Let's proceed with the vote." The ballots were a formality. Between my 8 votes and a few residents who clearly disliked Karen's control, I won by a landslide. The look on her face when the tally was read was worth every dollar I'd spent in the last 6 years. When I took my seat at the table, I could feel her watching me, trying to gauge my intentions. She didn't have to wait long. The first item I brought up wasn't landscaping, parking permits, or dog poop. It was an independent financial audit of the HOA's last 10 years. Karen's lips parted in surprise. "That's highly irregular," she said, her voice icy. "It's completely within the board's power," I replied. "Given the financial strain this community is under, a full review is in the best interest of every homeowner." I moved to bring in an outside auditing firm immediately. The room went quiet. Then, one by one, the other board members nodded. My motion passed 5-2. Karen's knuckles whitened around her pen. For the rest of the meeting, she tried to push through the agenda like nothing had happened, but her composure had cracks. She fumbled pages, lost her place, even mispronounced a street name she'd driven down 1,000 times. I didn't gloat, not yet, but inside, I was grinning like a man who just watched the first domino fall. As the meeting adjourned, she stepped close enough for me to catch the faint scent of expensive perfume and bitterness. "I don't know what you're playing at," she said under her breath, "but it won't work." I met her eyes and kept my voice low. "We'll see." The audit team arrived 2 weeks later, a trio of sharp-eyed professionals in tailored suits who looked like they'd eat balance sheets for breakfast. They weren't some local mom-and-pop accounting firm Karen could charm over coffee. These people were from a regional outfit with a reputation for finding skeletons in the most carefully sealed closets. The first morning, they set up in the HOA's cramped office, spreading out laptops, portable scanners, and a box of numbered evidence bags. I made sure to be there, not hovering, but present. A quiet reminder that this was my idea, and I wasn't going away. It didn't take long for the first cracks to appear. A landscaping contract from 4 years ago caught the auditor's attention. The amount billed was triple the industry standard for the work described, and the company's registered address was a UPS store in a strip mall 2 towns over. A quick business registry search tied it to a man with the same last name as Karen's sister. Coincidence? Maybe, but the auditors didn't believe in coincidences. Next came the pool renovation project, the one Karen had bragged about during the last meeting. The invoices were bloated with emergency structural repairs that, according to the contractor's own records, were never performed. The actual work done amounted to little more than replacing some tiles and repainting the deck, yet the HOA had paid for what could have rebuilt the entire pool twice over. And then there was the land sale. This one made even the lead auditor, a guy named Collins who had the emotional range of a parking meter, raise an eyebrow. 2 years ago, the HOA had sold a parcel of communal land, a small wooded area bordering the development, for a fraction of its market value. The buyer, a development LLC that on paper was owned by some faceless entity in Delaware. But peel back a few layers and you found Karen's second cousin, a real estate entrepreneur with a history of flipping properties for quick profit. That wooded area was now the site of 3 new houses, each selling for well over market price. Not a dime of that profit had made it back to the community. The auditors worked late into the evenings, sometimes past 10, combing through bank statements, email archives, and meeting minutes. I sat in on just enough sessions to know the pile of dirt was getting higher. Collins began assembling a neat binder, not for the board, but for external authorities. When I asked which ones, he just gave me a thin smile. The kind that have badges. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. She started missing meetings, claiming personal matters. When she did show up, she wore a brittle smile and avoided eye contact. Once I caught her rifling through a filing cabinet just before the auditors arrived for the day. When she saw me in the doorway, she froze, then quickly shut the drawer. "Just looking for a copy of last year's budget," she said. I didn't bother pointing out that all the budgets were now in the auditor's possession. Rumors began to ripple through the neighborhood. People whispered about questionable spending and missing funds. A few brave souls started showing up at the office to ask for copies of the HOA's financials, something Karen had always discouraged, claiming it would cause confusion. Now, thanks to the audit, those documents were technically public. Each new resident who left the office with a folder of printouts looked a little more suspicious of the woman who'd run this place like her personal fiefdom for over a decade. By the end of the 3rd week, Collins pulled me aside. "We're not done," he said, "but I think we've already got more than enough for a criminal referral." He didn't need to spell out what that meant. I'd been waiting 6 years to hear it. By the time the audit was halfway done, I knew it was time to stop playing defense and start swinging. I'd been patient for years, but patience only works if you know when to turn it into pressure. At the next board meeting, I came in with a folder thick enough to make the table groan when I set it down. Karen was there, back straight, hands clasped, doing her best impression of someone in control. The other board members, though, looked restless. A few of them couldn't even meet her eye. I started with a motion to freeze all board stipends and reimbursements until the audit was complete. Karen opened her mouth, but I didn't give her the chance to argue. Given the ongoing investigation into potential financial misconduct, it's the only responsible course of action. The motion passed by a comfortable margin. Her jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. Next came the spending controls. "From this moment on," I said, "no HOA funds can be spent without 2 signatures, mine and the treasurer's." The treasurer happened to be one of the newer members, a quiet man named Patel, who was already firmly in my corner. He nodded once, a small decisive movement. The motion passed again. Karen's pen snapped in her hand. I wasn't done. I introduced resolutions to halt any pending property sales until they could be reviewed by the board, and to instruct our legal counsel to begin proceedings to reclaim the parcel of land that had been sold to her cousin's shell company. That one sparked a brief but glorious argument. Karen accused me of overreach and personal vendettas, but the vote wasn't close. She lost, badly. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered in the hall with a few residents who'd been curious enough to attend. They were hungry for details, and I gave them just enough to keep the conversation alive. Words like misappropriation and breach of fiduciary duty traveled fast in a place like this. By the end of the week, even the dog walkers were talking about the big shakeup. That's when I made my next move, going outside the HOA. I scheduled a meeting with the county prosecutor's office. The assistant DA, a sharp woman named Rivas, listened while I laid out the highlights of the audit so far. She flipped through the copies of invoices, contracts, and bank records, her face unreadable. When she closed the folder, she said, "If even half of this holds up, we're looking at criminal charges." Perfect. I didn't stop there. I called a reporter I knew from my commercial real estate days, a guy who specialized in local government corruption stories. I gave him the broad strokes, careful not to burn my sources inside the audit team. Within a week, the city's biggest paper ran a front-page story. HOA faces questions over missing funds and land sale controversy. They even managed to get a photo of Karen outside the HOA office, trying to shield her face with a manila folder. The reaction was immediate. Residents started showing up at the office demanding explanations. Longtime allies of Karen began distancing themselves, suddenly claiming they'd had concerns for years. Even some of the more timid board members started calling me privately to ask what would happen if she resigned. Meanwhile, I knew Karen was cornered. She tried sending me an email, the first direct contact she'd attempted since I'd joined the board. It was short, almost casual. "Let's meet privately to discuss a resolution before this gets out of hand." I didn't reply. There was nothing to discuss. The next board meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and I had a feeling it would be the most important one in the history of Oakwood Hills. By then, the audit would be complete. The prosecutor's office would have their copies, and the fuse I'd been lighting for 6 years would be burning fast. By the time the calendar rolled over to the week of the next meeting, Oakwood Hills felt different. The manicured lawns and identical mailboxes were still there, but the atmosphere had shifted. Neighbors who used to nod politely now stopped each other in driveways, speaking in low tones, glancing toward the HOA office like it was the scene of a crime, which, in a way, it was. Karen's grip on the place was slipping, and she knew it. She'd missed 2 unofficial gatherings of residents, something she used to treat as a personal campaign trail. When she did appear in public, it was quick, furtive, walking her dog at odd hours, picking up mail after dark. The woman who once relished patrolling the streets in her SUV now looked like she was checking every shadow. 3 days before the meeting, she tried again to reach me, this time by phone. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was tight and rehearsed. "Dylan, we need to be adults about this. I think we can find a compromise that avoids unnecessary embarrassment for everyone." The subtext was loud and clear. She wanted me to give her a way out. That same day, one of the board members who'd always been in her corner, a guy named Wilcox, knocked on my office door. He closed it behind him, sat down, and admitted he was uncomfortable with recent revelations. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell he was looking to jump ship before it sank. I told him the truth. It was too late to save Karen, but if he cooperated with the authorities, maybe he could save himself. He didn't like that answer, but he didn't storm out either. Meanwhile, the audit team was finalizing their report. Collins called me one evening, his voice almost amused. "We found emails," he said. "Internal correspondence about that land sale. She knew exactly what it was worth, Dylan. She even joked about keeping it in the family." I made sure those emails found their way into the prosecutor's hands within 24 hours. Rivas, the ADA, called me herself after reading them. "You're about to see some movement," she said. "Don't be surprised if federal agencies start sniffing around. Some of these transactions crossed state lines." That was the kind of escalation you couldn't buy. Residents were catching wind of it too. Someone, not me, officially, had started leaving anonymous printouts of suspicious transactions in people's mailboxes. The more they saw, the angrier they got. A petition was circulating to demand a special vote to remove Karen before the next election cycle. In a community this small, that kind of rebellion was unheard of. 2 nights before the meeting, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Careful what you wish for." No signature, but the message was clear. If it was meant to scare me, it failed. I'd been waiting 6 years for this showdown. When the morning of the meeting came, I walked into the community center early, taking my usual seat at the board table. Patel was there already, reviewing the day's agenda, which had been edited to include discussion of audit findings. That was my doing. Slowly, residents filled the folding chairs, their conversations low but buzzing with anticipation. And then, right on schedule, Karen walked in. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a blazer that seemed a size too big, hair pulled back tightly, makeup a shade heavier than usual. She avoided my gaze, took her seat, and began shuffling papers with the air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. I knew what she was planning. Word had reached me the night before that she intended to announce her resignation for personal reasons and slip away quietly. She had no idea that the prosecutor's office, and possibly more, had a different timetable in mind. The meeting started like any other, at least on the surface. Karen tapped her pen against the table, calling the room to order with a voice that was noticeably less steady than usual. The agenda items were rattled off in quick succession, her eyes never quite meeting mine. When we reached discussion of audit findings, she cleared her throat and launched into what sounded suspiciously like a farewell speech. "Before we proceed," she said, forcing a thin smile, "I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for their dedication to this community. Due to Personal matters. I have decided to step down as president of the HOA, effective immediately. She was halfway through folding her papers when the double doors at the back of the room swung open. 2 men and a woman stepped inside, moving with the calm, unhurried confidence of people who knew they were in charge. Black jackets, gold badges, FBI in large white letters. A ripple went through the room. Chairs creaked. Murmurs started. The lead agent, a tall man with close-cropped hair, spoke first. Karen Stanley. Karen froze, mid-motion, hands still on her folder. Yes? Ma'am, we have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges including wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Please stand and place your hands where we can see them. The gasp from the residents was almost louder than his voice. For a second, I thought Karen might try to bluff her way through, but the color drained from her face. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, and the agents moved in, one reading her rights while the other secured her wrists in stainless steel cuffs. This is ridiculous, she snapped, the last remnants of her bravado surfacing. This is all a misunderstanding. Save it for your attorney, the agent said, guiding her toward the exit. As they passed my seat, her eyes flicked toward me. There was no smile this time, no smugness, just a mixture of fury and the realization that she'd lost control completely. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, but the FBI wasn't done. 2 more names were called, the HOA's bookkeeper who went pale as paper and a man sitting in the back row who turned out to be her cousin, the one who'd bought that parcel of land. Both were let out in cuffs, their heads down. Phones were out everywhere, residents recording the whole thing. By the time the agents left with their suspects, half the neighborhood had it streaming live to social media. The rest of the meeting was chaos. People spoke over one another, demanding to know what would happen next, who would run the HOA, what this meant for their dues, their property values. I let them vent for a while before stepping in. The audit will be concluded and all findings handed to the appropriate authorities, I said, keeping my voice even. The board will appoint an interim president until a new election can be held. In the meantime, all spending is frozen except for essential maintenance. This community will recover, but it will take transparency and accountability. The word accountability hung in the air like a bell toll. When the meeting finally broke up, I walked outside into the cool evening air. The FBI SUVs were still parked at the curb, engines idling. I watched as Karen was placed in the back of one, her profile visible for just a second before the door closed. No one approached her. No one waved goodbye. It wasn't the end. Not yet. Trials take time, and there would be months of paperwork, depositions, and public fallout. But the reign of Karen Stanley over Oakwood Hills had ended in front of everyone, not with a whisper, but with the clink of handcuffs. The courtroom was packed the day the trial finally began, months after Karen's dramatic arrest at the HOA meeting. I sat in the front row, dressed in a dark suit that felt heavier than usual. Not because I was nervous, but because this was more than just a legal battle. It was the final act of a story that had haunted me for 6 years. The prosecution laid out the case methodically: wire fraud, money laundering, document forgery, abuse of power. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Former board members who testified about Karen's increasing control, the audit team that detailed the missing funds, and neighbors who shared stories of intimidation and threats. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. I caught glimpses of sympathy from some jurors, while others scribbled notes furiously. Karen's defense was predictable: denial, blame-shifting, and occasional bursts of outrage. She painted herself as a scapegoat for a dysfunctional system, accusing me and the prosecution of orchestrating a personal vendetta. But the evidence was damning. Digital trails, forged signatures, and a paper trail that even her own attorneys struggled to explain away. One of the most striking moments was when the email surfaced, a string of messages between Karen and her cousin casually discussing the sale of the communal land as if it were private property, joking about keeping it in the family, while bypassing HOA approval. That was a turning point. The jury visibly leaned forward, some whispering amongst themselves. The trial lasted 2 weeks, each day bringing new revelations. Depositions revealed that Karen had authorized payments to shell companies, funneled HOA funds into personal accounts, and used her position to silence dissent. The defense tried desperately to discredit witnesses, but the strength of the evidence was unshakable. When the closing arguments came, my lawyer spoke with calm authority, weaving the narrative of a woman who had betrayed her community for personal gain. The prosecution's final words lingered in the room. This is not just about fraud, it's about trust, and how easily it can be broken when power goes unchecked. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they finally returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreperson stood and announced the verdict, guilty on all counts. Relief washed over me like a tide. Not just personal vindication, but justice for the neighbors who had suffered under Karen's rule. Sentencing came weeks later. Karen received 15 years in federal prison, a hefty fine, and was ordered to compensate the HOA for the stolen funds. Her cousin and the bookkeeper received sentences as well, though lighter. The judge's words were stern, a clear message that abuse of power and corruption would not be tolerated. With Karen gone, the court appointed a temporary board to oversee Oakwood Hills. I stayed involved, not as a member, but as an advisor. The new board launched reforms, transparent budgets, community forums, and clear rules to prevent another Karen's from rising. Slowly, the neighborhood began to heal. I sold most of the homes I'd acquired, letting new families take root in what was once a troubled community. But there was one property I held on to, my old house, the 2-story home that had been ripped from me years ago, now back in my name. I rebuilt the fence. This time, the stain was the same rich brown as before. The gate bore a new sign, simple, bold. No one has the right to dictate the color of my fence. Standing there, coffee in hand, watching the sun dip behind the familiar rooftops, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about a fence, or a house, or even a HOA. It was about reclaiming respect for myself, for my neighbors, and for the idea that no one, not even a woman like Karen Stanley, could bully a community into submission. And this time, I wasn't going anywhere.